So in this shiur, I'd like to continue on the topic relating to ne'emanus and kashrus, the final one that's planned for now. And I want to take things this time in a bit of a historic direction, which can also give us some insight for our times as well. And this also touches on the other topic which we started this week, a yid who's not ne'eman at all, a mumar, mechal Shabbos, which is certainly very relevant nowadays. So when we learn these halachas in Shulchan Aruch, so like I said previously, the way we imagine the Metzias is that broadly, generally, most people are observant, Shemei Torah mitzvahs. There are a few people, a certain percentage are chashudim, a smaller percentage are mumarim. We also assume back then most of the products were local. They're not very complex, like I mentioned last year also in the context of Chumras and Pesach. So you get the general impression that it was fairly easy to keep track of what's kosher and what's not. Nowadays, those two things are no longer true. Most Yidden, unfortunately, are no longer observant for the last 200 years or so. And products are no longer grown locally, produced locally. They're very complex. And even food that's prepared in a store and not in a factory is still a fairly complex project, complex affair. And we find in halacha and the history of halacha, there was another chapter in time in which they had similar questions, similar problems, when a large percentage of Yidden in a particular area were not Shemei Torah mitzvahs in the traditional sense. And it was also common for products to be sent from one place to another, and this created questions. What am I talking about? So I'm talking about the Anusim in Spain. The common term that's used is Moranos. Some say that's not a very nice term to use. I'm going to use the term Anusim. And that's the term we see in Svarim. And this is not just something I came up with on my own, because these dinim are in fact right there in Shulchan Aruch. I'm assuming I can't catch you by surprise with this trivia fact, because you should have come across it when you were learning the chaymer that we gave out. But at any rate, the Anusim are mentioned by name twice in Yeridea, in Siman Kuf Yutes, If Yud Beis. Anusim shenishiru ba'artzoisam, im hem esnagim bekashrus beinam lebein atzmam, ve'im b'yodem lehimalet, lamakim sheyichlu lavid es Hashem, soimchim al shchitasen, ve'ein oisrin yayin b'magon. And again in Siman Kuf Chav Daled, which I already mentioned, deals with Yain Nesach, and there are overlapping details there. So in Sif Tes it says, so Anusim, afilu atoivim shebehem, einam yochayim nizor mimaga goy, kivin shem chashudim alav, einan amanin al shalahem, afilu b'shvua, aval nemanim al shalachedim. So in Siman Kuf Yutes was talking about ein oiser in yain b'magon. They don't have a din mummer. They don't make the yain oster by touching it themselves. In Kuf Chav Daled, it's talking about their ne'emanus legabi, the actual wine that they have, and we're saying that that's something they're chashud on. They're not ne'eman al shalahem. They're nemanim al shalachedim. And the Ramah takes has a Haggah here, and he takes the discussion back to the question of touching ein oiser in yain b'magon, like we said in Kuf Yutes, and here he continues. V'dafka oisim shedonim adayin bein agoyim, v'oisim naveris b'fer hasim epnei oynes, rak betzinon nizhorim, v'af shalem navreich al nafsham, rak shem amtinim mishamom and akayetzibay, avalam oivrim gam betzina al averis, aval b'shaosim etchila b'oynes, adem kagoyim. These are details we're going to get into at length in a minute. In addition to these, there are other mentions of Anusim by name as well in Shulchan Aruch Even Ezer in the appropriate places where you might have questions. So where did these dinim get into Shulchan Aruch from? So Shulchan Aruch was printed for the first time in the 1560s, which is when the Mechaber finished creating it. The Agayos of the Ramah were printed 10 years later or so in the 1570s. Now I assume that when you hear the term Anusim, so the association you have is Inquisition, expulsion from Spain in 1492, etc. And you'd say, oh, it makes sense. The Mechaber actually managed to be born a few years just before the Geidush and Svarat, so when he grew up and wrote a Sefer, it makes sense that he would be talking about the Anusim, where he came from. But actually, these are three different things: Anusim, Inquisition, expulsion. And the Anusim problem in Spain started actually a very long time before the Inquisition, certainly before the Geidush. And the Makairis for these halachas in Shulchan Aruch actually are from the Shut HaRivash. The Rivash passed away in the year 1408, which is 84 years before any Gerush happened in Sfarad. So what's going on here? So you have to understand the history of Gzeiris Kuf Nun Aleph, the massacre of 1391 in Spain, which is 101 years or so before the famous expulsion. Now what happened in 1391? So you can look it up, but in short, there was some chief Galach, his name was Martinez, in Seville. Seville was in Castile. Back then Spain was divided into a few smaller nations, but this is in Castile. And he made it his personal project to incite the locals against the Jews. This went on for years. At some point he was demoted. Then at some point the people who had demoted him were out of his way. And in 1390 he was back in power, greater than ever before. And he kept on darshaning against the Yidden and until things finally blew up. And in 1391, the date given in Hebrew is Rosh Tammuz, Kuf Nun Aleph. So an attack erupted against the Jews in Seville. I don't know the numbers, I'm not sure where the numbers are from and how reliable they are. They say 4,000 Yidden were killed. And those who weren't killed were sort of terrified into converting. So that's what we call Anusim. But Anusim, not by government decree, Anusim by the pain of the sword. Once this erupted in Seville and Castile, it spread throughout the other cities and even into other parts of Spain. So it spread to Aragon as well, another kingdom. And the authorities just stood out of the way. They didn't stop it. And this way it spread from place to place. They say the number is given is that 100,000 Jews in Aragon converted, became Anusim at that time. At some point, they died down. Maybe the authorities finally got involved. And then, for the next 100 years, you had still a Yiddish Kehillah in Spain, alongside this huge new population of what we call Anusim. And that's really when this whole phenomenon started of Yidden that are trying to remain loyal to Yiddishkeit in private, but in public they're forced to act like Christians. And that's when all the halachic shilas began. Erst only later in 1478, in case you're wondering, is when the Inquisition began in Spain, probably in part due to these types of people. And then in 1492 there was the expulsion, and then you had more Anusim, but that's the timeline. So the two big poskim that dealt with these questions as they arose in 1391 were the Rivash and the Rashbat. So what I'd like to do here is go through all their tshuvas that touch on this question, particularly of Nemanos and kashrus. The ones of the Rivash are more well known, the ones of the Rashbat not as much. We'll get to that. And I haven't seen anyone that actually brought all of the tshuvas together, especially of the Rashbat, where you see different phases and different opinions over time. So where does the Rivash come from? So in short, one of the Chashva Shtet cities in Aragon generally is Valencia. That's where the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshas, was the Rav. Mentioned last year about a previous tkufa where he was a Rav in Saragossa, in the context of reading the Megillah in other languages. And the attacks reached there as well, and when he was about 65, he fled, like many other Jews at the time, to North Africa. So that's when the Sephardim have this big exodus, and Sephardim start spreading across the Muslim world, the Arab world, and that's where the term Sephardim really comes from, once they left Spain. So he ended up in Algiers, in today the country of Algeria in North Africa, and that's really how the Sephardic community started there and became a very chashuv kehillah from then on for many generations till recently. Like I said, the Rivash passed away in 1408, and already 150 years later, a little less, they printed his Sefer of Tshuvas before the Shulchan Aruch, and it was therefore very influential on halacha, especially you see in Beis Yosef and Shulchan Aruch. So someone claimed that literally every time the Mechaber brings the Rivash, he always paskins like him. I didn't fact check that. Because it was printed this early, we have a problem, a slight problem, which is that the censorship changed a lot of the Lashonos when you're learning about Avodah Zarah and Goyim, so all the words are a bit off. But let's start with the Rivash, and later we'll see that Rashbat quotes other things from him, Baal Peh, which shows that actually his opinion changed over time, but the Shuvas we have in front of us seem pretty consistent. So Rivash Siman Daled. I saw someone point out something interesting, that really originally there were 3 halakim of tshuvas in the Rivash, and each one corresponded to an era of his life. And it seems like the Matpisim, when they printed it, they got it entirely backwards. So the first group of tshuvas in the Rivash are all from Algeria. Like you see, this is in Siman Daled, all these shilas are right in the beginning. And then the last section, all the way, given the numbers of the tshuvas, obviously it's not relevant here, but you have the last section is the beginning, the middle section is the middle, the first section is really the end. Anyway, so this is addressed to another Yid. His name was Asterug Cohen. He lived in another city in Algeria. So this is the question they were dealing with. Back with, they all came from Spain, and they're still interacting with the people back from Spain. So the shaila was, can the Anusim Hazman to Avodah Zarah, to Christianity, can they press the grapes and it will be a kosher wine as if a Yid pressed it? And B'chlal, many of these Anusim produce their own wine, and they said they did it properly. Can we trust them? And if they ship it overseas, because there was this connection by sea between Spain and North Africa, so if they ship it and they say it's kosher, do we trust them? And b'chlal, if they invite someone to their house and they serve meat and wine, can we trust that it was done properly? And he wouldn't be machal and isser b'yadayim, av b'shachata yisraelu, and the kelim are fine. And b'chlal, the shchita, when it comes to mummer, right, the first thing you want to know, the shchita, do they touch wine, does it become yain asach? How do we view them? How do we treat them? So the tshuva begins with the etzem shaila of what's their just the fact that they converted. Before we get to their behavior and what they're doing day to day, the fact that they converted, does that make them a mumar l'avei zara? Is the conversation over? Right, that's what it says in Siman Beis. Right, mumar l'avei zara, finished. So the Rivash says you should know that someone who's over on all the mitzvahs of the Torah b'ainis, and even if Avodah Zarah, where the din is a Yehodik Val Yaver, okay, they're over on Yehodik Val Yaver, that's pretty severe. Avodah Zarah is severe, Yehodik Val Yaver is severe. But over Loi Nerag, you're still good. You're just as good a Yid as anyone else. You're not Pasal Eidos, you're like a Yid in every detail, because it was all Ba'inus. They still wouldn't punish you for it. And Anus Rechmana Patre, Lenar L'Sas Adavar. Allah is the Yehodik Val Yaver, and if you go ahead and you're over, then you weren't Mekayim V'ahavta, and if you did it before Hesya, you were over on V'nikdashti, and you were over on Le'sachalu. But it's all M'tech Ha'enes. So you're not Nifsal Eidos. This is the halacha in Shulchan Aruch is discussed in Ibn Ezer, and the Rivash is cited there as well. He says, like Nifsal Eidos, because if Beis don't want to punish you for this, so then you're not Nifsal Eidos. That's the two things go together. He says, there's a Rambam in Sanhedrin that says, if you do anything, you're Chayav Misas Beis for Bo'ainas, there's no Misa. Even if it was Yehodik Val Yaver, the Rambam says, even though you're Mechal as Hashem, but you're an honest, you're not Nerag. Not only that, Dr. Rivash, you're also Potter B'din Shemayim, you're Potter from Kares. By Moilech, it says in Chazal that Samti Pana B'Ishahu, there's Kares there, Loy Honest V'Loy Muta. So it's already the Rashbat already had a tshuva about this type of question. Apparently, even earlier on, there were Yechidim, there were individuals that were that converted Machmas Yira. The Rashbat already then said, and even though he should have been killed, allowed himself to be killed, B'Nikdashti, but it was Machmas Yira, and there's no Chi of Beistin. So therefore Yisrael Heim, Shchitasan Muteres, Ve'ein Eisvin Yaim D'Magon. Wow, okay, so we started off, we're very open-minded, we're very understanding, very lenient. All the Anusim are still wonderful Yidden. Now the question is, what about their actual practice day to day? So the Rivash says that this would apply l'halacha under the assumption that this person is keeping all the Averis, is adhering, is observing everything b'chol yachaltoi, as much as he can, and then whatever he does in public, we'll say, okay, that's always, he's under duress. But if the person, even beinoy lebein atzmoi, when no one will see him, he's already starts being over, starts becoming lax, and is over and averis, it's nevelus utrefes, l'teyavin, lahachis, so then he's pasal eidus, and he's a chashud, lo yisadavar, like the halachas that we learned. Even though a mumma l'davar echad is not a mumma l'kol ha'torah, but he's a mumma lo yisadavar. Certainly, if it's Avodah Zarah and Shabbos, then you're Mumma L'Kol HaTorah Kula, then you're Mamash like a Goy Gomer. You're going to say, what do you mean? Yeah, now the person's being lax, but the whole thing started ba'inus. So maybe even now it's ba'inus, Now, whatever he's doing now at home, that's beratzen. If he's doing it where there's no concern that you'll be seen and you'll be caught and you'll be yaliluhu v'yimsaruhu, if you don't have the problem and you're still being over avedus, that shows that you're like any other Jew who's lax in his observance. Okay, so he just presented two different types of anusim. So now the shaila is, what's the chazaka? You don't know who this yid is. You don't know who this anus is. What should we assume? So now he introduces a new point. He says, the question is, why are they not leaving? Why are they staying there? That itself seems to suggest something about their frame of mind. So he says, therefore, the anusim that stayed in the artus hashmad this entire time, so that seemingly seems like there's some willingness here, and they didn't escape like many others. Mehem ashirim, mehem aniyim, both rich people and poor people. Whatever excuse you're going to have, we find that both types have been able to flee. So if you're still there at this point, we don't have dates, but we know it was about 18 years that this could have been. So he writes, kashrus. And now you need a chakiras chacham. Now you need a chacham to investigate and to confirm, this guy actually is misnag bekashrus beinam lebein atzmam, and he confirms that for some reason they feel prevented from being able to leave. And if he can confirm both things, then harehem ki Yisraelim gemurim, and then you can rely on their shchita and their yayin. And that's essentially what you saw in Shulchan Aruch, those two details. From here. But if they're over beratzen, even one aveda, so if it's Avodah Zarah and Chil Shabbos, then like a Goy Gomer. And if it's other Yisurin, so then they become a Mummer, Lo Isadavar, to each thing. It's still not Oyser Yayin B'Magoy, it's not a Goy Gomer that answers the Yayin by touching it. What about the actual wine? Back to the question, the guy has wine. Is it mutter or is it osir? So we said he's not Oyser Yayin B'Magoy, right? So it's true, but the Yayin is still osir. Because all the Anusim who live in Valencia, where he's from, or even the other lands of Spain, we know they're not nizer from stam yenam, from stam wine of the goyim. And even if they avoid that, they can't avoid the guy touching their wine. Pashat, what can you say? What can you do? They have to keep up appearances. So wine is a big part of the culture. You're interacting with goyim, you're Anusim, so you're living in a Goyish context. It's impossible to avoid that type of interference with the wine. And chashud doesn't matter whether you're ba'inus or baratzin. They're chashud. There's something they're not particular about. So they're all chashudim. That if a guy would touch it, they would still drink it. So if they're chashud, so then they're not naman. What about shel acherim? That's its own question. The maskana is neman al shel chaveiroi ve'ein neman al shel atzmai. This is also mentioned in Shulchan Aruch, like we said last week, Siman Kuf Yates of Zion. So that's his conclusion. There's another tshuva, a pair of tshuvas in the Rivash, Siman Yud Aleph and Siman Yud Beis. Siman Yud Aleph, though, is about other Anusim related questions, Gittin. So he repeats at greater length his whole theory about why the idea of the oinus, that it's all ba'oinus, and therefore, even though they were over in Yehodik Vayaver, but they're still okay. I'm not going to repeat it again. The next Siman Yud Beis, which comes in continuation, is actually addressed to the same individual, another Yid, Reb Amram, from another city in Algeria. Interestingly, he's also the one, there's a famous tshuva of the Rivash about Kabbalah. It's quoted in Chassidus, the famous line, Ani mispal adas zeh hatinik, which was said as an anti-Kabbalah statement. I'm not thinking about all the Yechudim, and I'm just thinking, I don't know, Chachmas. So that whole interesting tshuva is also addressed to this Reb Amram. At any rate, so he asked these questions, all these questions about Anusim, Siman Yud Aleph, Siman Yud Beis. So Siman Yud Beis, which is again about the wine. Here the wine is from Mallorca. We're going to get to Mallorca in a second with the Rashbats. And the Anusim said they sent it, and it's really from Morviedro. Morviedro has a different name today in Spain. But interestingly, there's a book on the Rivash, which I quoted last year as well, by a fellow named Hirschman. He points out there's a marker that says that in the whole Valencia, the only city where there were Yidden left was Morviedro. So that's the significance. And their Anusim are sending it. They're saying, oh, we got it from that place. Okay? So again, he says, Ein Anusim should be Mallorca, anywhere else. They can't avoid Stam Yenon, and they can't avoid a Magagoy. And even the good ones were kosher le'edos, but if a guy touched it, they would still drink it. So they're chashut, so they're not neman, but they are neman al shel chaveiroi. And here he adds this point that they're not even neman b'shvua, which he got from the Rashbat, which is also mentioned in Siman Kuf Yates. He says otherwise, if shvua helps, then a mum or echan nevela should be neman on shchita if he swears, I swear I'm going to do it right, or I'm haaretz by t'mai. Why do you need to have a chavrus? Let him just swear each time instead of just telling you. Obviously, shvua doesn't work. For mushba v'oimidhu mehar Sinai, every time he's over an avera, he's being over on a shvua. Okay. So look at Shulchan Aruch. So in Siman Kuf Yates, Sif Yud Beis, the Anusim. What's the marker? The Rivash. Look in the Beis Yosef there. He quotes both shuvas from the Rivash in Siman Kuf Yates. Derech Zin Siman Kuf Chav Dalet. Like I said, the Rivash is a little more well known. Now let's go to the Rashbat. So the Rashbat is Reb Shimon ben Tzemach Duran. Nice Spanish name. He was from the island that's known as Mallorca or Mallorca, depending on the spelling or the language. Mallorca is an island in the Mediterranean between Spain and North Africa. It belongs to Spain already for many hundreds of years. So the Rashbat was born in 1361, so when he was around 30, 1391, that's when the massacre happened. It crossed the water into the island. The attacks happened there as well, so he also fled to Algiers. And so the two of them, the Rivash, who was older, and the Rashbat, who was younger, were both there serving as Rabbanim. He was there till he passed away in 1444. So despite the difference in age, but they both experienced roughly the same thing, the life before, the attacks, life afterwards. The Rashbat, in addition to his shuvas and the tashbets, which we'll get to in a moment, and I've quoted different ones of them before. Last year I quoted about someone who swore not to be a shliach tzibur anymore, about the importance of tefillah b'tzibur, is it a mitzvah or not? I mentioned last year regarding the famous chumrah that in mikveh we try to be yotzei l'kol hadayis. More recently I mentioned that Tzemach Tzedek mentions his tshuva about what if a gzeira was done b'koyach cherem, what's the significance of the term koyach cherem, the tashbetz was lenient. But he has other works and other topics as well, interesting things. One of them is a Geshmak Pirush on Pirkei Avos, part of his work called Magen Avos. If you ever saw the Meister of Cook, the Teras Chaim edition of Pirkei Avos with all the Pirushim of the Rishonim, so it's in there as well. So in Pirkei Avos, Perek Dal, there's a famous Mishnah that attacks in different Lashonis, Kol Hanena Medivrei Seira. So there's a famous Rambam there in Pirush HaMishnayos, where the Rambam seemingly basically attacks Gans Klal Yisrael, because by the time of the Rambam, it had already become fairly well accepted that people had a career from Torah, whether as a Rav, as a Rosh Hashiva, etc. So it became a profession. This is salary. So the Rambam says it's hapech, this Mishnah, it's hapech Chazal, it goes on at great length. This also is relevant to Kolel. For a short while, certainly if those who spend their whole lives in Kolel. So this is a topic that's still discussed, relevant today. So the Rashbat, in turn, in his Pirush, to say the opposite, to prove the opposite from Chazal as well, and at the end he gets the personal note. He says, and that's basic, why am I going on at great length like this? To be appointed a Rav and a Dai. And this is, he says it in the plural, but the royal we, but he's talking about himself. This is the basis for what I did. And the only reason I only started being Naeg Heter after I looked into this sugya and I wrote a whole bunch of shuvas about it, which are also printed in the Tashbets, and others agreed and said, yeah, very good. And we saw the Gedolim before us, Chassidim Anshe Maisa, Goinim Rabbanim, also were already taking money. And anyway, when I was learning Torah, it was not Kedei Leisha Baresh. Part of it is your intention. Why are you learning? Is it, Kardim Lachmerba? So he emphasizes that was never his original intention. He says, Nechasim Hayilanu, we had property, we had possessions, and I studied medicine, which was a very respectable profession in Eretz Edoim, in Europe. But only saved our lives. We left all our possessions behind. Whatever we did manage to salvage, we gave to the Goyim to let us alone, so we shouldn't be compelled to convert. And that should be enough of a basis for a heter for what I'm doing now here in North Africa. That I want to continue remaining in Torah, Torah Seinu, U'Menasenu, Yem V'Layla. So now in North Africa I have to take a salary. Says if medicine was a good profession here, then I wouldn't have this problem. But in North Africa and the Islamic countries, I guess the doctor, the title of doctor, as it was in Europe, did not translate into those places. And he didn't. Why don't I go back home? I don't want to go back home because things are still in upheaval, and it's always nugzeiris and shmad. And he quotes the Chazal that say that someone who's bitten by a snake becomes terrified of a rope. Everything looks like a snake, so I would never want to go back and put myself back in that environment. That just gives you some, obviously that's its own halachic discussion, like I said, the shayla of taking money, but gives you an indication of what the situation was like, and the choice the Yidden had to face in these situations. At any rate, his tshuvas, which overlap a lot with the types of questions the Rivash deals with, you can find in the Tashbates, not to be confused with the other Tashbates called Tashbates Cotton from Ashkenaz. Today we have a Mechan Yerushalayim. They did a very nice edition, just like they did for the Rivash. However, as they point out, he had, his luck wasn't as good as the Rivash. His tshuvas were printed for the first time almost 200 years after the Rivashes in the 1730s. By the way, there's an interesting could say a legend that says that this edition of the Tashbits never rots, never gets wormy, and there are Sfarim in the last bunch of years that quote a Shmuah b'Shem Rebbe Rashab, that the Rebbe Rashab heard the Shmuah, and over the years, Rebbe Rashab would go to different libraries, and he would take a look, and he always confirmed that even if the other Sfarim were rotting, or whatever was going on, but the Tashbits was always untouched. Yeah? So it only was printed much later. The Beis Yosef actually does quote him a little bit because the Beis Yosef had a kitzer of his tshuvas in Ksav Yad, and it is quoted a little bit even in Simcha Chav Dalet here in this context. Last week I quoted from the Ur Gadol who quotes the Tashbits, so that's why I wanted to go through his tshuvas. They're not as well known. I go through all of them, which I haven't seen anybody do, like I said before, although I don't know with the time we have left, how much we can cover. Let's see. So in Tashbits Chelik Aleph Sim Samach Gimel, so this is something he wrote to someone by the name of Moshe Amar. His father-in-law was back in Mallorca, and here you have this family split in half. The son-in-law is in North Africa, his father-in-law is still in Mallorca, and he's one of the Anusim. But they're still in touch, they're still a family. Now his father-in-law sent him wine. Now what? It's awkward. So he writes, they asked the Rivash and the other Balei Hera, and they didn't want to say anything. It was so soon, it was right after it happened, they still hadn't come up with an approach. How do we view this completely novel situation? So here you see Lamashal, he's quoting the Rivash and saying the Rivash at some point along the way wasn't sure. So they gave him the shus to ask me, even though I wasn't as senior as the Rivash, and he could follow what I say, and this is when I came up with the following. So he starts off with the same question of, first of all, the Anusim themselves, b'tzad ha'oines, forget about their behavior. So he doesn't even get into the question of, there was the younger of the two, right? Yeah. So he doesn't even get into the question of Yehorik Vayavar, I guess it's so obvious to him, but he starts on the next question. Why didn't they leave already? He says, L'chayr there's a Rambam in the Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah that says, Taka, if you're an Anos for Avodah Zarah, you're potter. But im yochel amalit nafshe v'levroyach mitachas yad amal chadash be'eino esa hinei hu kekelev shav al kiyai v'hu nikra eved avodah zarah b'mezid v'hu nitrad min ha'olam haba v'yered l'madrega tachten shel gehenim. And this is the basis for his whole discussion. Small problem is that if you look in the new Rambams today, they point out that this whole passage doesn't appear in the early manuscripts of the Rambam. Maybe someone along the way thought it was important to add this point. It is in some manuscripts. They mentioned the Rashbat is one of those who quotes it. However, it's pointed out that in the Igeres HaShmad of the Rambam talks about these inyanim, and he essentially makes both points. That really you're supposed to leave, you shouldn't stay around. He also makes the point that if you do, and we can be Melamed Tzchos, there's a room to be Melamed Tzchos. So the Rambam does touch on this. So we see the Anusim could have left long ago, like many did. But he says, I'm Melamed Tzchos. Says we shouldn't judge, essentially. Maybe an early source of someone saying we shouldn't judge other people. We shouldn't say they're Gleim Gemurim, that now they're a Mumar L'Avodah Zarah. We should assume that it's one of the Einsim. We don't have to verify each person's case individually, but we know generally some people can't afford the ship fare. Some are afraid that if they start getting on the move, that will expose them and they'll get punished. They can never know if someone will overreact and want to punish them. Or maybe they tried and their plans fell apart or whatever happened. And the Rambam is talking about where none of those apply. We know for a fact that the person can leave and it's just not. He also says, even if we know that there's no yira, like the king, let's say the king says, whoever wants to leave can go. But still, we should still be lenient, because maybe deep down they're concerned that maybe it's all a trap. Maybe the second we actually try to leave, they'll kill us. What about the chazaka? Right, the Rivash said, fine, we don't know why everyone's not leaving, but at this point the chazaka is that if you're staying, maybe you're talking not so okay, unless we prove otherwise. He says no, he goes further than the Rivash, or at least he did originally, and he said, we should assume that the chazaka stays the same until you prove that this person's no good. He says, Elamai, at the end of the day, only a person himself, like in Parshas Kadeshim, you have the idea of Yeresim Alekacha, some things only you know. He says, the Rambam isn't talking to us, we as other people, we can't judge. When the Rambam says, you're no good, but the person should ask himself. He should ask himself, am I really trapped here, or am I able to leave? But that's just for the person to know, that's not for us to say. So that means, for sure, they're not touching things and making them yayin nesach. They're not a mummer l'aved zara. And v'cheskas kashrus, more than what the Rivash said. And now he wants to be malamed zchus on their wine, also more than the Rivash. And he wants to say that either they're not considered a chashud, or it's considered shalacherim, even though it's being meichel. The way we learned it is oichel and machil. That's still considered shalay. Shalacherim means literally someone else's, but he wants to say that it's considered shalacherim. And then he says, then I found the Ra'ah and the Rashbat that we mentioned last time. The Ra'ah says that there is a musik of a chashud lechel, ein a chashud lahachil. The Rashbat says there's no such thing. If you're chashud lechel, you're for sure chashud lahachil. So he says, okay, even though the Rashba is right, but the Ra'ah says it, so that's something. And then he adds an interesting point. He says, even according to the Rashba, im nisbarer lanu she'enoi chashud lahachil, we can still determine that this guy is not chashud lahachil. So av bishu chashud lahachil, so bazoi, he's only chashud for himself, not for others. So this is a source, interesting source, which no one else seems to have mentioned, for what we were talking about last year, about the idea that maybe there's some room to use your own input and decide, okay, maybe this person's taka chashud lachil, but he's not chashud lachil, even though as a cloud we don't say that, but maybe this person is different. He says, afil l'das harashbazal. That we nisbarer lanu, we determined, we followed the guy long enough, and we determined that he is chashud lach, he's not chashud lach. It says, kol shekein here, shachasan yachshileu chamev la'achile iser, his father-in-law, the shver would be machshel, his son-in-law. Maybe unlike the shviger, because it says in Shulchan Aruch about chameisai, but chasle lazari da'aba, you wouldn't do that to someone. And then in the end, he starts talking about the Igeres Kiddush Hashem, the Igeres Hashmad, the Rambam, and how that fits into what he said. We don't really have time. There's another tshuva, Chelik Aleph Siman Samach Vav, and here you'll already see a bit of an evolution in how he understood the reality. And I saw someone argue that there must have been more years between them, even though they're right next to each other in the Tashbitz. A whole complicated question about how there's a shkacha, there was a guy had wine, and there was supposed to be a yid mashkiach, but they got into a whole argument about whether the shkacha was a good shkacha, whether she had backdoor access. It was a goya. So the mashkiach himself was saying, I'm telling you it's no good. There was an anus, another yid, an anus that said, actually no, the mashkiach is lying, it is good, it was fine. She couldn't have gotten in. So they had a whole argument on who to trust. So part of the question was, do we even trust these Anusim at all? So they said, right now, back in Mallorca, our practice is that if they say they bought it from a Yid or they made it in their home, we trust them. But out to Mashkiach, we can't trust them. Okay? So he gets into a whole discussion as to whether this makes sense or not. At this point, he says, you're generalizing. He says, at this point, why are you generalizing all these anusim? We have some that are coming now, and we see they're goyim gemurim. So you see already at this point, time had gone on, and the picture had gotten a little clearer. So how do you know if he's kosher apostle? And we see that they're not chayshish for chil Shabbos for hestia, lafi hanishma, ruban, the karev lekulan, or all mechal Shabbos. And even those who were careful originally, hechmitzu ve'enan nezharin klal. So things had changed and things had developed, and he's a lot less sanguine and positive about their behavior. But still, after all of that, he still comes around and he tries to be masber why technically you could still trust them and have a kashrus until proven otherwise. And elamai, by hashgacha taka, you can't make sense not to trust them, because then hashgacha, the whole concept of hashgacha is that you're going to confront the guy. If the guy does something wrong, you'll say, you can't do that. But if you're an anus, how can you be mashgiach on the guy? You get in trouble for that. That's bekitzer. I'll just say one more minute. In Tashbit Chelik Beisim and Samach, he has another shayla about wine that was sent from Mallorca, and here, which Rivash, it's like the same situation, more dvidero. And from here on, from Chelik Beis and on, we see the Tashbitz is machmer much more. And I've also noticed that people point out that in all of this discussion, the more time went on, they never invoked the concept of tinik shenishba, which is the concept that is used today, which is interesting to point out. From now on, he says, Vadei Anusim, Eidem Namonim Mahach Sheyayin, etc., etc. Although in this case, he has reason because he got it from someone else, Tashbitz Chelik Beisim Nenesh Aleph, he says, the Rivash originally wanted to be matir with cheese, based on the Ra'ah, who says, and I told him no, which is also interesting that the Rivash B'chal said that. This is the Tashbitz we quoted last week from the Aragadol. And then weiter, Chelik Gimel, Siman Chaf Aleph, and then Chelik Gimel, Siman Shin Yud Beis. We'll conclude with that as time went on, we see that it looks like the Tashbitz ended up moving towards being machmer and saying that it's not okay. Obviously, Lagabe Bizman Hazeh, so like I said, you have the question of Tinik Shenishba, even though they never mentioned it, but it's possible to use it. We also see there's a certain sympatheticness, at least originally. They were trying to understand where these people are coming from, and just as time went on, they felt, okay, these people, they knew they still were raised in Yiddishkeit, and now they're hechmitzu, so it's hard to defend them and justify what they're doing. Okay, stop.